Okay, great. I just want to talk to you for about 3 minutes, and I'm going to talk very fast. It's going to sound like I'm trying to sell you a car, but I want to do a good job of framing this. And when we talk about teaching Black Lives Matter in the classroom, I think it's appropriate to begin by thinking about Congressman John Lewis. We lost a great voice this past weekend. And as I was thinking about this presentation, I was tying together some of the great questions that you asked beforehand. How can I weave Black Lives Matter into the broader civil rights movement? I think your answer there is in the life of Congressman John Lewis, the fact that this has been an intergenerational struggle, and that's an asset in the way that we think about teaching the Black Lives Matter movement and tying it to broader history. How do I introduce Black Lives Matter discussions in the classroom and create a safe space to share ideas and feelings? We'll talk about that. And last but not least, but I think this is the most important, how to put Black Lives Matter and civil rights movement front and center from day one and every day thereafter. And that's going to require some creative framing. And that's what I want to do for you very briefly this afternoon. In that sense, as we move forward, I want to begin with John Samach, who in a wonderful essay in the Supreme Court said, American nationhood rests upon a common faith and a civil theology, largely composed of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution, and elaborated rights of the individual as found in the Constitution within its Bill of Rights. Unfortunately, for most of American history, we know that these very same things have been denied to African Americans and to various other peoples of color. Someone mentioned in the remarks, I teach predominantly Chinese students, Asian students. So you could make the same case, but today as we're talking about Black Lives Matter, this becomes a critical issue, not only in understanding the history of African Americans, but thinking about our contemporary moment as well. We have to talk about this also in the context of what Thurgood Marshall framed in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, where he said, look, let's be clear. Education is not simply the teaching of the 3 R's. Education is the teaching of overall citizenship, to learn to live together with fellow citizens, and above all, to learn to obey the law. And he goes on to say, and I think this is very powerful, I don't worry about Negro kids' future. They've been struggling with democracy long enough. They know about it. I think the George Floyd killing, and certainly Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery this year alone, remind us of the importance of the reckoning with American democracy as it relates to Black Lives Matter. And the fact that we have a moral imperative to cover this for the same reason that Stokely Carmichael framed it in the New York Review of Books in 1966. Stokely Carmichael, writing in that moment after another period of urban unrest, said, in a sense, I blame ourselves, together with the mass media, for what has happened in Watts and in Harlem, Chicago, Cleveland, Omaha. Every time the people in those cities saw Martin Luther King get slapped, they became angry. When they saw 4 little girls bombed to death, they were angrier. And when nothing happened, they were steaming. We had nothing to offer that they could see except to go out and be beaten again. We helped to build their frustration. Part of the process of diffusing frustration in our contemporary moment is not to run away from the substantive teaching of what this means and how we contextualize it in a way that we help students make sense of it and navigate this moment as well. Having said that, that requires us to look critically at the issues of race, at the issues of class, which of course are informed by race, and certainly by issues of gender, which are also informed by race in the United States. Having said that, when you ask the question, how do I teach this? We want to move quickly into talking about these 6 areas. First and foremost, you want to decolonize the curriculum. And by that, I mean that you want to make sure that you're including a range of diverse voices in your instruction. And part of that decolonization process is not just including people like Lorraine Hansberry, pictured here, and her wonderful novel, A Raisin in the Sun, but thinking about the range of achievement and experiences that Black people bring to American history and privileging that in your instruction. You also want to avoid recolonizing the curriculum. And by that, I mean only talking about Black people when it's relative to some area relative to civil rights or slavery or enslavement. That would be the wrong move in terms of emphasizing that Black Lives Matter. We want to tell the full range of the experience of African Americans in this country. We have to diversify the canon, so we have to think outside of traditional texts that we use in the classroom. We need to privilege intersectionality. How can we present different voices and different people who give us a range of experiences? We want to embrace interdisciplinarity, which is why I have Lorraine Hansberry here. So English, music, literature, art, anything that we can do to work with other folks in our building or other educators to think, pair, share, and create great units on this content. Last but not least, my last 2 slides with you, we have to think concretely about how this moment connects with the past. I know a lot of you have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. But the best way to understand Ta-Nehisi Coates is really to know that in the title of Between the World and Me, he's in conversation with W.E.B. Du Bois, who in The Souls of Black Folks, chapter 3, wrote Between Me and the Other World. If you don't get that play on words, you fail to appreciate the fact that Ta-Nehisi Coates and W.E.B. Du Bois are in conversation about Black lives, about what it means to be Black in America. And that 100-year or 100-year plus conversation is part of how you can frame this for your students for the entire year. In fact, part of what we have to remind, whether you teach elementary, middle, or high school, is don't forget the power of biography. Think about John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and what their lives can tell us. Think in terms of the broadest terms of engagement. Avoid the trap of framing through the familiar. Embrace what John Lewis called good trouble. And finally, and most importantly, we all have to remember this: learn to teach, but teach to learn. In that sense, think about framing Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement in terms of core democratic values for elementary students. And in that process, as we reflect on these, things like life, each citizen has the right to protection of their life. You're not outside of your pocket. You're not really pushing the boundaries. If you go into school on September 3rd or September 4th and you say to your students, this year what we're interrogating is the meaning of American democracy as expressed in these core democratic values. The questions we ask around these this year are going to bring us into conversation with what we saw this past summer, and are going to allow us to reflect on how far we have to go as a nation.